Spinning. Hi, and welcome to Across the Canon. My name is Brian, and I love the Bible and learning about the way the entire story flows together. Thanks for joining us on this episode. Today, we're discussing one of the themes that has captivated me and grown my love for the scripture, and that is the theme of the temple. Today, we are joined by Dr. Nicholas Moore, who is warden and lecturer in the New Testament at Cranmer Hall, St. John's College, Durham University. He earned his DPhil at Oxford and previously served in ministry at Buckinghamshire and Hartlepool in the UK and in Paris. He's the author of Repetition in Hebrews and this book, The Open Sanctuary, Access to God and the Heavenly Temple in the New Testament. Dr. Moore, thank you for joining us on Across the Canon.
It's great to be with you, Brian.
And this is take two, because if we're going to be honest, we were off to an awesome start for this conversation. And then I realized we weren't actually streaming. So let's try this again. All right. So, Dr. Moore, why don't we start off with a little bit of your background? What inspired you to become a scripture scholar?
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, well, I grew up in a Christian household, and so I think I'd say I'd never known a day when I wasn't a Christian, didn't know and love the Lord. One of the delights for me as a teenager and then as a young adult was discovering scripture for myself. And as I did that, as I read through scripture, I discovered that actually I already had encountered a lot of it through the liturgy of the church. So I'm born and brought up in the Church of England. I'm an Anglican by conviction as well as birth, and now ordained. And the big thing for me then was after university, I explored the question of whether or not I would go and pursue ordained ministry, and began training. And with that, I had the opportunity to learn Greek and Hebrew. And then also quite quickly, it became apparent that I would have the opportunity to do further graduate study. And so with that, I did a master's in New Testament, then onto the DPhil, as you've mentioned. And all of this coming from a background in languages. So my degree was French, and that's where I started off. So actually, just the joy of being able to explore other languages and texts in those languages was a great thing.
And as an American, I seem to have a sense of jealousy for those of you who are in Europe when it comes to language, because it just seems like the proximity to multiple languages is so much closer. I love Spanish. I love other languages, but the opportunity to engage is not quite the same here as I would imagine it is for you.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be that positive about the state of language teaching in British schools, to be honest. But that, and the Brits kind of feel a world apart from the Europeans, where, the Dutch have several fluent languages in their head, and the Brits usually can't cope with trying to learn one more. But nevertheless, the opportunity to learn French from the age of 11 for me was a real boon, and I loved it, and I persevered with it, and I did bits of other languages as well. So it was a natural thing to come and be able to enjoy Greek and Hebrew when I then came to study theology formally.
That's awesome. And so in your doctoral work, you ended up focusing on the book of Hebrews, which turned into a published manuscript for you. So how did that work in Hebrews help lead you into this idea of the open sanctuary?
I'd always been fascinated by Hebrews, and one of the things I was fascinated by was this use of cultic language. So that was one of my early ideas, was to explore Hebrews in relation to the temple of its day. I mean, assuming it was written before the destruction, or the temple of recent years, if it was written in the late first century, after 70 AD, when the Jerusalem temple was destroyed. The thesis itself was about the theme of repetition in Hebrews, so looking at repeated things within the letter, because I think there's been a negative tradition within the church, particularly within Protestantism, so my own tradition, and kind of being self-critical here, of associating repetition with ritual and with vanity and uselessness. Mm-hmm. The repetition doesn't do anything. And a lot of that, I think, is owed to Hebrews, which talks about how the old covenant sacrifices didn't cleanse the conscience and therefore weren't effective. But the problem I have with that sort of simplistic reading of Hebrews is that actually that doesn't capture the psychology of going to the temple for a first century Jew. that actually you don't go there and think, oh, here I am today because what I did yesterday didn't work. No, you go there thinking this is God's gracious provision of how the covenant relationship with his people continues. And it's a good thing that every day and every Sabbath and every Day of Atonement, we have these particular rites that help us. So in that book, I argued that the nature of repetition actually depends on, or the evaluation of repetition depends on how it relates to the Christ event. If it promotes the Christ event, prefigures it, helps you to appropriate its benefits, then it's a good thing. If it risks or threatens the validity of the Christ event, replacing it or detracting from it, then it's a bad thing. The thing about that work is that a lot of it, the most substantial chapter, took me right into the heart of the cultic bit of Hebrews. Yeah. So I was looking at this question of a heavenly tabernacle. For Hebrews, it's the tabernacle. There's the good reason for that, which is that this is Exodus 25. Moses is given instructions to build the tabernacle exactly as he's been shown on the mountain. So he's been given a heavenly revelation, and he's to replicate that faithfully, which he does in the tabernacle. That means that in some sense, the earthly tabernacle, this portable tent sanctuary that Israel had in the wilderness, is a reflection of heaven. Yes. And that verse, that idea becomes hugely important in later Second Temple Jewish literature, also in other parts of the Old Testament, and then important as well for the New Testament. So that's kind of what got me into it. When I was then writing on Hebrews, I've written a number of pieces, sort of essays, articles on Hebrews in the years since. Quite often I've found myself returning to this question of cosmology. What is the universe like? How is it structured? And so from there, it was a natural thing to step out and say, well, where do we find this idea across the New Testament and within that ancient context?
Perfect. And so that's exactly where you start the book. All right. So on page 1, you say it this way. You say, early Christians drew on understandings of heaven and temple to make sense of what had happened in Jesus. Or better, they sought to place their experience of Jesus into what they already knew about the universe and its relationship to the temple. So could you unpack for us what those early Christians would have understood about the universe and how the universe relates to the temple?
This is the real value of the kind of historical work that biblical scholars do, that if we only know the New Testament and we read it in isolation, which understandably for a lot of Christians, this is a sacred text and therefore it is read in church and privately as well, we don't really have a sense of what's going on in the world around it. And so when Hebrews talks about a heavenly tabernacle, when Revelation talks about a heavenly temple, that could feel like complete outliers. They just happen to have creatively thought of this idea and picked it as a kind of metaphor or something. But actually, when you look at the context of Second Temple Judaism following the ancient Near East, what you see is that this idea is quite widespread. Mm. So in the ancient Near East, there is this strong sense that creation, the whole created order, generally 3 parts: heaven above, the earth, and then the seas, perhaps the kind of underworld sort of around it. That is, in some sense, or at least a part of it, is a habitation for a god. That's how it's come about. Even if in ancient Near East creation epics, it's a kind of cosmic conflict that gives rise to it. Nevertheless, the victorious god will create his home, usually in the heavens above. We see this in the Old Testament as well. So you'll find it particularly in the Psalms, the idea that God stretches out the heavens as a tent, like a tabernacle. There's often connections between the heaven above and the temple in Zion or Jerusalem. So it's there in all kinds of ways in that ancient context. You see it really explicitly in the Old Testament in the book of Ezekiel. So Ezekiel 40 to 48 has this great heavenly vision, probably our first ascent narrative. And Ezekiel goes up into heaven and he sees this massive temple. A bit of debate over whether that's purely an eschatological temple, it's one that's to come, or whether it's actually one that's really there. I mean, I tend to think it's something that he actually sees, even if it's also waiting to be inaugurated. So a whole range of ways in which you see this, and one of the things I do in the book is chart kind of propose a spectrum of the different range of views. But the idea that the universe is a temple, we even find that in Greek and Roman writers, actually usually fleetingly and passingly, but we do find it, or the idea that heaven is a temple, or that there's a temple in heaven, that's quite widespread. So the early Christians, and certainly the authors of Hebrews and Revelation, but actually I argue that the gospel writers as well, have this conceptuality there. And it's one of the things that's the background into which they then try and put their understanding of Jesus as priest and as sacrifice and as temple as well in the case of John's gospel.
Yeah, and when we were speaking earlier, you had mentioned how oftentimes one of the reasons why books like Revelation and Hebrews can feel so foreign to us is because in part we don't share, or we're not built into that kind of cosmological view that the early Christians would have, and so we're not assuming things walking into the texts that they would be assuming and living in.
That's right. And not only are we not assuming those things, we're also got a whole range of our own assumptions, which might well be unexamined. We kind of, because we're brought up with this now, we kind of assume, of course, we're in a solar system and we orbit the sun. And that's just, we know that. And that's, this is where Rudolf Bultmann, the 20th century German theologian, has this very significant piece on New Testament and mythology written in the 40s. And he opens by saying, we just can't believe in a three-tier universe anymore. It's, modern man can't bring himself to believe that. And therefore we need to demythologize the New Testament. Now, I like the way that he phrases it, because there is something about those of us who have electric lights and now electric cars, and we know that the universe is like this, and we've sent space probes. Of course, that hadn't even happened, but in the 1940s, but it has since. How can we really believe in that? I think my pushback or my reservation about Bultmann would be, even if we demythologize, we have to remythologize, and we just end up doing that instinctively. So I have, not in this book, but actually in a lecture I gave earlier this year, explored this language of parallel universe or another dimension that contemporary scholars will often use as a way of trying to say this is what heaven is like or where it is. And the thing about that is that's another mythology. I mean, that comes as much from Marvel Cinematic Universe or the Twilight Zone as it does from contemporary sort of philosophy of science. Although, I mean, it is I haven't read a lot, but there is a lot on multiverse theory and so forth, and you realize that the edges of scientific kind of hypothesizing are quite mind-blowing and quite strange. There's a great scholar called Max Tegmark who just says, well, surely we should expect the nature of reality to be really strange and mind-blowing. And in that sense, I kind of say, well, why do we have to choose which strangeness? Why can't we enter into the biblical text, enter into the world of the biblical text, and just enjoy the strangeness that is there? Which is as strange as the kind of reality we live in.
Yeah, and so speaking of helping us enter into that strangeness, right? In the book, once you kind of open up the first two chapters and give us that basis of understanding the temple and how it functioned, you walk then through kind of backwards order: Revelation, Hebrews, the Gospels, and then the early Christian writings. So obviously we're not going to cover every piece of that, because you do a great job of unpacking all kinds of details in these chapters. But I'd like to start at Revelation, because that's where you begin. So what is the significance of the temple in the book of Revelation?
The backwards order is quite important. I like the fact that this is something that's taken me into that end of the canon, and then kind of work the other way, because inevitably we tend to go Gospels, then Paul, and then probably stop. But if we're lucky, we might get to Hebrews and Revelation. Revelation is the epicenter of this imagery in the New Testament, so it's really significant in that regard. It's just full. I mean, it's full of Roman imperial imagery as well, but it's also full of imagery drawn from the Jewish temple. Mm-hmm. I didn't necessarily find what I expected to find. When I came to Revelation, I was thinking of Revelation 4, which is the beginning of the heavenly visions. And what happens there is John has his vision on Patmos. He sees Jesus. Then he has the letters to 7 churches. 4 verse 1, I looked, and there in heaven, behold, an open door. And I thought, okay, this is open door for Revelation and so forth. And then Revelation 21 and 22, where you have the city, the New Jerusalem, the heavenly Jerusalem that's come down to earth. And it has 12 gates and they're open. So I was kind of thinking there's an amazing sort of openness, which, you can see reflected in the title of the book. The striking thing then, if you trace this language through Revelation, is that it's very closely associated with judgment as well. And so that's a finding that is perhaps less comfortable for us, but it is one that follows from the idea of temple as a place of holiness and purity, and the sense that actually normally in the earthly temple that was kind of contained, very carefully guarded. I mean, Herod's temple, there was a low wall with warning signs on to Gentiles not to cross it on pain of death. So there was this, and there are various accounts of foreign emperors trying to go into the temple, and sometimes they get struck down. But it always causes massive uproar and protest from the Jews in Jerusalem. And rightly so, that sense of God's holiness being something that is in the temple and it both needs to be protected in the sense of reverence, but also is dangerous because holiness can break out. But we don't see anything of that kind of extent until we get to Revelation, and in a sense in which this heavenly temple, the heart of God's being, when it is opened, that is where judgment comes out from. So the angels who take the bowls of wrath and so forth they're kind of cultic servants. They're like priestly agents, and they come out from the temple or from the throne or from the ark, and that's where it comes from. With that, there is also that strong note of salvation and revelation. So there is a really strong note of, the altar being a place that the martyrs shelter underneath, and the openness at the end. But those are the kind of two themes that go together in Revelation.
Yeah, and I've got a quote here from that section because it struck me. You said the barrier of the temple door or veil does not so much protect God's dwelling from defilement as protect what is outside from destruction. And when the barrier is removed, God's dynamic holiness emerges in the form of judgment. And now I was sitting on the couch next to my wife when I read that. And I can only describe what I experienced as I was sitting there thinking of that image of the temple and the holiness of God, and that when that holiness comes out, there's a judgment that goes with it. My first experience of something like a holy dread or a holy fear that I did not expect in a fairly scholarly work, right? This isn't, a work on spiritual reflection, but the way you crafted that image, I was struck in a fear that was a reverent fear that I can only say thank you for, because it changes things when you start to experience that a little bit.
And we're recording this in Advent, and both in the Roman Catholic Church and the Church of England, we have Kingdom season before Advent. So we've been having readings from Revelation. In fact, we've just got to Revelation 21 in morning prayer, which is great. But a lot of it is, it's uncomfortable stuff, and it's important that we are reading this and finding. Then there's lots can be said about that. A scholar like Richard Borkham has written quite a lot, quite helpfully, I think, about this. What do we make of the judgment in Revelation? But I think as long as we're drawing it back to God's holiness, that's a really significant thing. And as always in Scripture, there is mercy intermingled with the judgment through that book.
Absolutely. So let's shift back over to Hebrews for a minute. So you do spend some time discussing how that old cover or the Old Testament tabernacle is a type or a copy of the heavenly tabernacle. So what's the significance there?
So often we think about typology in terms of figures. So Jesus is the great David's greater son, that kind of idea. And in that case, you have a type, David, and then you have the antitype, which is Christ, and that's how they relate. And that's quite a sort of linear and historical thing. What I think Hebrews does, and it actually uses this Greek language of tupos and anti-tupos, so something that's like an imprint that's made, and then you have both the pattern here and the pattern that's on the thing that you've pressed it into, like a signet ring and wax, that kind of, or striking a coin or something like that. And Hebrews will actually talk about the type being the heavenly original that Moses saw, and the antitype being the earthly tabernacle, which means that you kind of get back to the original type, as it were. So it's a sort of spatial and historical thing, that if you've got the type is here, it's heavenly, and it's kind of before Moses, and then Moses builds the tabernacle, which is the antitype here, and then Jesus comes and sort of enters heaven at this point in history, but it's got back to the original type, is effectively the sort of language that Hebrews is using. My friend and excellent scholar and Dominican friar, Richard Ounsworth, goes and explains this using the idea of potato printing. When you kind of cut a potato in half and you carve an image and then you splot it in paint and then do it on paper. So if that works for you, there's a nice image.
I'll be honest, I have never heard of potato painting.
Oh, really? Yeah,
No.
potato printing. Okay, there we go.
Printing. Oh, that's fantastic. That is a useful image. So no, I love that. Thank you. So what impact does that have on our understanding of how we relate to Christ, to Christian worship, the heavenly tabernacle type, antitype?
The thing that I found striking in this is that when so in the ancient world, so in the time of the exile, Israel doesn't have a temple. It's been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. After 70 AD, Israel doesn't have a temple, and it's never rebuilt. And the question is, what do you do when your temple is destroyed? Or even, what do you do when your temple is defiled? I mean, that's a key question for the Qumran community of Essenes. And part of the answer that emerges in texts is, you don't need to worry, because actually if the heart of the presence of God is in heaven and his angels serve him night and day, then there is always right worship going on, and you can join in with that.
Okay.
So what do we see Daniel do in the book of Daniel? 3 times a day, he goes to his room, he opens the windows east towards Jerusalem, where the temple is not, because it's been destroyed in the setting of that book in exile, and he prays. So he's keeping time with the rhythm of celestial worship. And we see this, so the Greek phrase diapantos, continually, is often translated, but actually there's a scholar called Dennis Ham who's demonstrated that really we should be translating that regularly, because it's the same Greek phrase that translates the Hebrew tamid, which means the twice daily sacrifices. So when you're exhorted to pray regularly, which Hebrews does in chapter 13, my argument is you're actually being exhorted to pray twice daily, in sort of, in keeping with the timings of the celestial worship. And some texts will connect that with, angelic worship takes place as the sun rises and as it sets, as kind of rhythms of the day. It's interesting for me as as an Anglican minister, and the idea is that we have the daily office twice a day. Obviously in monastic life that becomes, sort of sevenfold office. But that sense of actually there's punctuation here that is a good thing that keeps you sort of in tune with the universe. I found a really rich idea.
Yeah, and as I was to say, so for me as a Catholic, I immediately think of the Liturgy of the Hours, right? In this way. So it sounds to me, and this is something that very much kind of drew me into a more liturgical understanding of Christianity, was this idea that our earthly worship is intended to reflect the worship of heaven. Is that fair to see that that's what's going on there in Hebrews?
I think that's absolutely right. And one of the things that I trace towards the end of the book is where this goes in other early Christian literature. And you see very clearly that the idea that our prayers would ascend to heaven like smoke of an offering, or that they go into bowls that angels take into heaven and offer. This cultic imagery is precisely informing Christian worship. It does, again, I would see this as a later development, but it does get taken up into the understanding of the Eucharist.
Yes.
I guess, we need someone from the Eastern Orthodox tradition here to kind of complete the set, but also because my understanding of Orthodox worship is that it is precisely centered around the idea of a heavenly liturgy that you simply kind of, I was going to say plug into, which feels like a really irreverent sort of phrase, but that kind of image of you go and you join in on something that's already taken care of.
Yeah, like there's a stream that you're tapping into there, right? And so, I'm thinking back a little bit earlier about what we said about how important it was, and you just brought up the Eucharist, the idea of fencing off the temple because of holiness. To my mind, I start thinking about Paul's warnings in First Corinthians, right? That we should discern, the body of Christ, lest we come into judgment, maybe even fall dead from partaking this thing unworthily.
The early church certainly had a very strong guarding of the Eucharist, didn't they? In the sense that actually, if you weren't baptized, then you had to leave before it took place. And there's part of me thinks, there are questions about how you would do that culturally in contemporary sort of Western settings, but there is something quite profound and good about that sense of this is a really holy thing that we're doing together, and therefore it's not simply a kind of free-for-all that anyone can be around.
Yeah. So, we've got a little bit of time left here, and I wanted to spend a bit looking at how you take the temple and the tabernacle imagery and use that to help us see things in the Gospels. So in your chapter on Matthew and Mark, you look at in Mark the idea. You see some sort of temple connection between Jesus's baptism, transfiguration, and crucifixion. So how is the temple sort of in the background informing our reading of those three events?
I like to see those three events as a kind of triptych, so sort of three panels that together give you a greater whole. I think they're very clearly linked. I think they hold a structural function for Mark. In all of them, you have Jesus named in some way as Son of God. You have some kind of access to heaven, I would argue. A lot of readers of Mark have pointed out that you have this quite strange verb schizo, to tear, for the heavens in chapter 1 at the baptism, but then you have the same verb schizo, to tear, for the temple curtain at the crucifixion. And it's interesting, if we take Mark to be the earliest gospel, as most scholars do, and Matthew and Luke are using him, they're happy to use the schizo word for the temple veil, but they use an open, anoigo, open, for the heavens. So, but that seems to me, there's the only two places he uses that verb. It seems a very clear signal that he's connecting these things together. So already we have open heaven and open, or tearing of heavens and tearing of temple veil, suggesting that there is a cultic significance to heaven. The Transfiguration is a classic theophany, effectively. They're up a mountain, there's sort of cloud, there's, Jesus becomes bright and white. So it feels very much like a kind of evocation of Sinai, for example. So all of those things together, I think, do give us a sense that Mark has some concept of a heavenly sanctuary, which Jesus in his ministry, baptism and transfiguration and death, is opening for us. The other clue in Mark is that at the trial scene, Mark's Jesus is going to talk about there being a sanctuary not made with hands. And there's a kind of expectation that he's going to take up position there after his crucifixion. So I think if you put all those things together, you can see that this idea is there in the background for Mark as well.
Yeah, no, and that creates a nice framework for being able to see some of that come together. So in Matthew now, you focus a bit more on the theme of mountains. And so, what is the significance of mountains? I love mountains. I've just had the opportunity to go hiking in the mountains with my daughter. We had a great time, and there is something about being up there, right? That's different.
Mhm.
So, what is it that Matthew is emphasizing here with these mountains, and how does that relate to heaven, earth, temple?
There is something about mountains, and this is uh, maybe not completely universal, but many cultures and many parts of the world have holy mountains.
Yeah.
So Mount Olympus would be a classic example, but you find this Asia, Africa,
Mhm.
both Americas. And also, when you look at ancient temples, again, both you think about some of those amazing Aztec or Inca empires, but also then ancient Near East ziggurats. They basically mimic a mountain.
Yeah.
They
If you
are
don't have a mountain, you make one.
yeah, exactly. That's right. And so the sense that actually the temple mimics the mountain is the meeting place. And there is in ancient Near Eastern cultures this sense of the cosmic mountain.
Yeah.
And if you look at some of, particularly the Psalms again, the ways that they talk about Mount Zion and about Jerusalem, you would think that it was Everest. I mean, it just sounds amazing and huge. And I've never had the privilege of going to Jerusalem, but you talk to anyone who has, and they say it's not that big a mountain. But the point is that its significance, what it holds, is precisely being the center of the earth. The axis mundi, the kind of joining point that connects earth and heaven.
Yeah.
And I think that Matthew is drawing on that. I mean, he loves mountains. So we have a mountain of temptation. We have a mountain of teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. We have the Mount of Transfiguration. And then we have the Mount of Commissioning, probably the Mount of Crucifixion as well. So suddenly you think, yeah, you're doing something here with mountains. The other thing Matthew does is draw quite a stark distinction between heaven and earth. And with that, again, you'll just find the temple is sometimes the mirroring point. There's an assumption that God's throne in heaven, the temple, its ark, the covenant below, they simply are mirrors of each other. And that's a very stark dichotomy, but it's presented that way in order to demonstrate precisely how Jesus overcomes it or bridges it in his ministry.
Oh, that's super thankful or super helpful there. So I'd like to, probably land the plane here on one last image, and that is something that I was really intrigued by, which was your proposal in how we should read John 14 as maybe more clear, more helpful when we incorporate this temple imagery into it. Would you mind talking about that a little bit?
Yeah, I might just turn it up while we're talking.
Yeah.
The thing about John's gospel is that Jesus clearly is the temple in John, or a temple. It's explicitly said after the temple clearing. He says, destroy this temple in 3 days. I'll raise it. And the Jewish leaders he's speaking with say, well, that's crazy. That Herod's temple renovations have been going on for 46 years. How could you possibly do that in 3 days? And the narrator adds, he was talking about the temple of his body. So there's an explicit identification of the temple with his body. Interesting image. We find it also in Philo. We find it, we kind of find it in Corinthians as well. So Paul will use that sort of image. So it's not a completely unique image. And once you've got that key, you also then can see that things like in the prologue, when it says the word became flesh and tabernacled among us, skenao, this tenting word, could just mean dwelling or lived, but almost certainly carries that kind of resonance as well. Plenty of other places as well. The thing is that sort of temple Christology, Jesus's temple, is so loud and clear, and people often think this is a zero-sum game, that if Jesus is temple, nothing else can be temple. Not the Jerusalem temple, not the people of God, not heaven. But actually, I just don't think we're playing a zero-sum game. I tend to think that with this kind of imagery in a lot of places, but certainly in John's gospel, he just loves symbolism, and he's quite happy to pile it up in all kinds of ways.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Now, John 14, this is the beginning of the farewell discourse, this kind of lengthy, fairly unique material to John, in which he's preparing his disciples for his departure. And he says, I'm going to prepare a place for you, and I'll come again. I'll take you to be with me. But he starts off by saying, in my Father's house, there are many dwelling places. The only other place we have a phrase like my Father's house is just a slightly different word for house, but we have it in John 2 in reference to the temple. So clearly he's using temple language, and also that language of place is quite significant. Caiaphas says later in John, if we don't deal with him, then the Romans are going to come away and take away our place, our nation and our place, i.e. the temple. And so what I think we have here is genuinely a sense of heaven is temple, and Jesus is going to prepare it, and then he's going to bring people to live with him. The slightly unique or unusual thing about that is the idea of living in the temple. I mean, you didn't really live in the temple complex. People would stay there, perhaps. There were rooms for that. But there were lots of rooms and chambers as part of the wider temple complex in Jerusalem. So that is a key part of the imagery that I think works. And the reason that this reading, I think, works is because there is such a strong sense of spatial movement. Jesus is saying, I'm going, then I'm coming, then I'm taking you. The rest of these chapters are much more relationally focused, and that is definitely the predominant note. But actually, I think there's a spatial aspect here that we just can't do away with. And that actually, I would say that vindicates using this passage at funerals, where it is a favorite. The unfortunate thing in the kind of history of this passage is that the Vulgate translated it with mansio, which simply means a kind of place to stay. Right. But it's where we get our word mansion from, and the idea of kind of mansions in heaven or loads of rooms in a hotel or something really isn't, I think, what's going on here. But nevertheless, I'd want to retain this passage as a good one for funerals for that kind of reason.
Yeah, and I think that gives it that much more resonance and depth. Right. I'm not just getting some luxurious materialistic experience of heaven. No, I'm being prepared a room in the temple of God.
Yeah.
And that is far more rich and far more meaningful, I think, and just plays across the narrative far better. So, Dr. Moore, thank you so much for coming on with us today. I think your book is tremendously helpful for any modern readers who just want to get a better idea of what was in the heads and the hearts of the first Christians as they are thinking through what happened with Christ and now how they relate to that. And so again, I would urge any of my listeners to, by all means, go check out this book, The Open Sanctuary, spend the time, work through it. It is a valuable read, and I'm convinced that your spiritual and intellectual life will be bolstered for it. So thank you again, Dr. Moore. It has been a pleasure speaking with you this morning.
Brian, thank you. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Take care.